Um, so the other thing I want to ask you, the UN, they declared July 11th, the
Yeah,
Srebrenica massacre
yeah,
Remembrance Day.
yeah,
It's proposed by no other country than Germany, which they
yeah.
did, massacre of the Jewish
Mm,
people during World War II.
mm.
Why do they do that? I mean, I don't know exactly what happened on Srebrenica
No,
at that time, but there is
yeah,
some dispute about the number of people being killed. Some
yeah,
people saying 8,000. But right now we have an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and we don't declare any kind of a Remembrance Day. We don't even
no,
try to stop it. Okay, and throughout the history, there has been rape of Nanking, with 300,000 people died on the
yeah,
low estimate. And
yeah.
of course, the Turkish genocide against Armenia. There's plenty of genocide happened. Why did they pick on this particular thing? What's the reason?
To embarrass China. That was the primary purpose of it. Xi Jinping has just been to Belgrade, to Serbia. The Serbs are, of course, blamed for the Srebrenica massacre. China has taken a strong position on the issue of Gaza. It's put together. I mean, we were talking about this crazy peace conference, this absurd peace conference in Geneva over Ukraine. China looks like it's preparing a real diplomatic initiative involving Brazil. There's been a very important meeting between the Chinese and the Brazilians agreeing a joint position on peace in Ukraine. The Arab League has taken up the idea, first floated by Wang Yi, for an international peace conference to resolve the situation in the Middle East. So they want to embarrass China by raking up this issue of Srebrenica again and saying, look, Xi Jinping, he goes and shakes the hands of the leader of a country that committed genocide, just 20 years ago, whenever it was, 30 years ago. And at the same time, they want to um, counter Chinese criticism of the ongoing and actual genocide that is being conducted in Gaza. Now, I have to say straight away that this diplomatic ploy was a complete failure. Most countries in the world either voted against it or abstained.
Mhm.
Only a minority of countries actually ended up supporting this proposal. So instead of um, actually signaling the West's disapproval of Serbia and what happened in Srebrenica, and ultimately embarrassing China, what the West again demonstrated is that the narrative of world events, of recent events, that it is so committed to, is losing traction. I think this is a major embarrassment, and it's probably the reason why this vote attracted almost no attention in the
Mhm.
media in Britain.
Okay, so even even in Britain, they didn't pay much attention. Yeah,
No,
they know how
no,
embarrassing this is, I guess.
yeah,
Okay. Now, is there some elements of racist against the Slavic people?
yes.
I feel like in Europe, like all the white people are not really equal. I do feel like there's a hostile feeling towards this Slavic in general. Remember Madeleine Albright, right? It was Gonzalo Lera mentioned this that when she went back to her, I guess her native country, was somewhere was it she was signing. There was a book signing something, and there were people from Serbia. Some people was
Mm,
protesting her
mm,
because her role played for the bombing of the Belgrade. She was in the Czech Republic, I think, and
mm,
then some people ran in, and Madeleine Albright said something. Oh, those Serbs, it was like a detest of those people. It was
yeah,
very obvious how much she hated those people.
yeah.
So, is there some racist element in there?
There is indeed, absolutely, and it's very old, and there are many causes to it. Firstly, I should explain that the Slavs, as a group of nationalities, a linguistic, and if you like, loosely connected ethnic group, are the largest single group in Europe. They're about 40% of the population of Europe is Slav. So I mean, there's
Okay.
we're talking about a very large proportion of the culture and people of Europe. So that's the first thing to say about this. And that has created, by the way, historically, a certain nervousness in that if the Slavs ever do come together and sort out their problems and work together in a concerted way, not as they did during the period of the Soviet Union when uh, the Western Slav states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all the rest, were basically forced into an alliance with Russia. But, an actual real coming together of the Slavs. Well, that would be a major block. That would be a colossal block inside Europe. So there is that concern, but there is undoubtedly also a sort of racist concern, and the racism is absolutely there. And of course, during the time of during the Nazi era, and in the late 19th century, it was absolutely straightforward and open. I mean, it was absolute. I mean, the Germans, the Nazis, literally always spoke about the Slavs as undermentioned, lower, subhumans, people who weren't really proper Europeans in any real sense, and which was one of the reasons they were so violent against them. But there are two underlying reasons for this, beyond the sheer number of Slavs. The first is that the Slav languages are very distinct and different from those of Western Europe. Western European languages of Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Britain, are based on two roots: German and Latin. And Slav languages are not connected with either of those two. They're very different, and they're very difficult, by the way, for West Europeans to learn and understand. The number of West Europeans who are able to speak Slav languages is very, very few. And that immediately distinguishes the Slavs from the Westerners. The other thing about the Slavs is that in many cases, they have a distinct religious identity. The Eastern Slavs, the Russians, and the Southern Slavs in the Balkans are Orthodox, which may not seem so much in the Chinese world because these
Yeah.
are all Christians. But in the world of Christianity, which is always divided and always feuding, it again makes them very suspicious and very different in some sort of way. So people are very hostile to that aspect of Slavdom as well. That they are so they're culturally different, they're linguistically different, they're religiously different, and of course today, again in the West, there is a conception, a feeling about the Slavs that they are socially conservative. But this may be true of many
Uh-huh.
Slavs. It's not so true of all of them. And it wasn't true either always. I mean, I would say, for example, that in the mid 20th century, the Slavs were actually in some ways more socially liberal than some West Europeans were. But today, they're seen as socially conservative, more likely to be religious, which again makes them suspect to West Europeans. And lastly, Slavs, for one reason or another, tend to be very patriotic
Mhm.
and very connected to their countries and their societies, which again, some West Europeans and Atlanticists, in general, are deeply suspicious of. But all of this, as you quite rightly say, has developed a kind of racist dimension, and you could see that it's there in the rhetoric. And as I said, it's been there for a long time, certainly going back to the 19th century, and particularly strong, as I said, during the Nazi era.
Yeah. So, and then also there's some about the royal families, right? Isn't it the British royal families blame the death of the Tsar's family and the British? They were
Mm.
some intermarriage. I mean, there was some marriage there, and then when the Tsar fall, the British blame the Russians for that, or there is some conflict there as well, some hatred there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, this is of course massively hypocritical as well, by the way. But the Romanov dynasty,
Romanov,
the
yeah.
royal family of Russia, and the royal family of Britain, the
Yeah.
Windsors, are very closely related to each other. So Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia, and George V, who was the king of Britain at that time, were cousins. I mean, they were members of the same family. And I should say that Nicholas spoke perfect Russian and
Mhm.
perfect French, but his preferred language was English. And the language that he spoke to his wife in was English. That most people don't. His private letters and communications were written in English. Now, it's absolutely true that during the Russian Revolution, the Tsar and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks. They were well executed, murdered, call it what you will. And the royal family in Britain were very shocked, and they've always held it against the Russians that this happened, and the Bolsheviks in particular. And famously, it was a major reason why no British monarch would travel to Russia until the Romanovs were um, properly received proper burial, and Russia apologized for what it had done and all of that. But the reality is, everybody knows, and what I'm going to say is not controversial history, is that after the Russian Revolution, first the provisional government, the bourgeois government that was in power in Russia for a short time, and then the Bolshevik government, led by Lenin, contacted the British repeatedly and said to the British, look, we've got the king here, the Tsar here, we've got his family. We don't really know what to do with these people. We're worried that if they stay here, there might be an effort to restore them, and we can't accept that. Can you take them? Can you let them go into exile in Britain? Because they're related to your royal family, and that's the solution. And the British said no. And we now know that the person who insisted that the answer should be no was the king, King George V, Nicholas's cousin. And the reason he did that was because this was a time of great social unrest in Britain itself. And the king was worried, almost certainly without cause, that if the Tsar came to Britain with his family, the working class in Britain, who were sympathetic to the Soviets and hostile to Nicholas, would hold this against the king himself, and he might face political problems. So, in effect, the King of England betrayed him.
Yeah.
And it was the King of England's betrayal that ended in the tragedy in which the Tsar and his family were killed. By the way, the Russians, I should say this just for a Chinese audience, the Russians have bitterly regretted, almost in the moment that the royal family was assassinated, the fact that they did that. This has been a major issue. The Soviet government felt very guilty about it. Lenin felt very guilty about it. They sort of pretended for a long time that it hadn't happened, all of those things. China dealt with this problem far, far better. So when the last emperor was finally arrested with his family, instead of doing what the Russians did, they put him through a re-education, and he became a citizen, and he was allowed to live in Beijing and look after his garden and all of that. And I mean, that was a much, much, much wiser, more humane and clever thing to do. And it's something where maybe the Chinese learned the lesson from the mistake the Russians made, or maybe it was just a reflection of Chinese culture, which is not to be vindictive in that kind of way.
That's interesting. And maybe that explains why the British are particularly hostile towards Russia in
Yeah,
general, right? There is this racist element to it, and plus this
yeah,
historical event that,
yes.
yeah, yeah, okay.
Well, absolutely. And if we go back to the Slavs, um, I mean, of course, the great Slav nation is Russia, which is a superpower. And
Mhm.
one of the other reasons for this great suspicion of the Slavs, the non Russian Slavs, is that there's always this worry that because they're Slavs, they will ultimately look towards the great Slav nation, which is Russia, and look to Russia to take their lead from Russia. So there's that play as well. And I think you're probably right. I think there is perhaps some explanation there of this extreme hostility that the British have to Russia,
Mhm.
which is very difficult to understand at many levels.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to understand, but it, there's one more
The
thing. I just want.
Russians find it very difficult to
Uh-huh.
understand.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things to understand about the Russians is that culturally they are very Anglophile.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they read English novels and English books. Shakespeare is very popular in Russia. Sherlock Holmes is very
Yeah, yeah.
popular in Russia.
Mhm.
All of that, and Russian boys and girls in the 60s and 70s, sometimes to the annoyance of the Soviet authorities, were very keen on British rock music. The Beatles and all that. So it's much less so today, by the way. I mean, now that the Russians have seen how antagonistic to them the British really are. I
Mhm.
mean, even amongst those kind of people, there's been a turning away from Britain. But as I said, the British attitude to Russia makes no sense, and it has been a colossal mistake and lost opportunity.
Yeah, this topic of Russian hate is an interesting one. I just find it fascinating.
Mm,
And Gonzalo Lira had an episode to explain, why Victoria Nuland has this
yeah.
hatred towards Russia, which I find also very interesting. But anyway, so it seems like
Mm,
different people have different reasons, but they
yeah.
all hate Russia. It seems
Yes.
to me.
Yeah.
Okay.